It was a calm morning in Rome, but the sky above the Vatican seemed to carry a silent sense of expectation. In the discreet corridors of the Curia, whispers moved like wind between ancient columns. Something was about to be announced that did not follow the usual rhythm of papal communications. When the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang at an unusual hour 3, slow and solemn, chimes those who knew the signs of the Vatican understood. Something was different that morning. At 10:03 a.m., a statement was delivered to the official press of the Holy See. It was not a papal bull. It was not a doctrinal decree. It was a letter, simple, handwritten, signed by Pope Leo XIV and addressed not only to the Church, but to the world. In it, the Holy Father wrote, "It is time to reconcile fidelity with tenderness. It is time to unite duty with deep listening. Today I publicly recognize a servant who has walked silently through the walls of power, carrying not ambition but humility." Then came the name Cardinal Pietro Parolin. What followed was not just a tribute, it was a symbolic, spiritual, and historic gesture. Leo XIV announced that, from that day forward, Parolin would hold a new title, not hierarchical, but profoundly ecclesial, guardian of the invisible bridges. In the Pope's own words, his mission would be to care for the spiritual bonds between people's hearts and consciences, bands that politics never managed to unite, but that the Spirit has never stopped touching. The world fell silent, because this was not about a position. It was a calling. In the sections to come, we will explore the impact of this decision, how the quiet path of Pietro Parolin became a seed of global reconciliation, how his discreet fidelity, often overlooked by the press and political analysts, became the cornerstone of a new spiritual diplomacy within the Church, and how, in a time of noise and polarization, the Church chose to entrust to the humble the sacred power of healing the invisible. Prepare yourself, because this is not merely an institutional story. It is a story of faith, of fidelity, and of bridges built with tears. It was the third day of the liturgical week. The flowers that adorned the Vatican cloisters were already bowing beneath the high sun, but inside the apostolic palace, everything seemed suspended. The sound of footsteps grew lighter, as if the very corridors knew they were about to witness a new spiritual exodus. Pope Leo XIV, faithful to his custom of praying before every major decision, had spent hours in silent adoration in the Rediscover chapel. There beneath the mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, he didn't ask for counsel, he asked for listening. And in the depths of listening came the conviction. It was time to elevate not just a man, but a spirit. The next morning, the bells rang not to summon, but to prepare hearts. No one knew exactly what the Pope would announce, but something in the air signaled that this gesture would reach beyond diplomacy and liturgy. In the consistory hall, the cardinals waited in deep silence. Pietro Parolin, the man who for so many years had walked the labyrinth of the Curia with wisdom and discretion, was there, serene, with his eyes fixed on the central cross of the altar. When the Holy Father entered, he brought no documents, not even a book, only a single lit candle in his hands. Placing it on the altar, he said, "Not all light is born of words. Some lights are only kindled through the fidelity of the invisible." And with that, he turned to Parolin. Leo XIV walked toward him and, to the silent astonishment of everyone present, knelt before him. It was a break from ceremony, a gesture that dismantled formalism, a gesture that said everything without needing explanation. "Today," the Pope said, "the Church is not promoting a man but consecrating a way of life, a way of serving with discretion, with patience, with a love faithful to the shadow of the cross." With a voice full of emotion, the Pope continued, "For years, Cardinal Pietro Parolin has been the diplomatic voice of the Church, but today, we recognize him as her contemplative conscience." And in that very moment, a new spiritual ministry was created, the Guardian of Silent Alliances. This new title did not refer to agreements between nations. It referred to invisible covenants between souls, to those alliances that hold the Church upright when the world tries to bring it down, to those bridges that are only raised through prayer, to the golden threads connecting monks, kneeling mothers, forgotten bishops, and restless youth into one mystical body. The impact was immediate but not noisy. It began on the margins, in small dioceses, in humble communities. Bishops and priests began reporting a new hunger for deep spiritual formation. People began writing letters to the Curia, not asking for miracles, but saying, "We want to learn to listen as Parolin listened." That same week, the cardinal retreated to a small convent in the outskirts of Assisi, where he began a series of spiritual retreats for Catholic diplomats from around the world. There were no discussions of geopolitics. There was silence, Eucharist, sharing, listening. The world began to understand. True diplomacy in the kingdom is not achieved through strategy but through holiness. And by reorienting the mission of one of today's most influential cardinals, Leo XIV did something even greater. He restored to the Vatican the art of gentleness, the art of tenderness, the art of caring, the art of serving without being seen, of leading without shouting, of loving without demanding. Pietro Parolin accepted the new appointment with only one sentence: "The greatest gift a servant can receive is to be forgotten in the presence of God." And so, on that day, the Church took a deep breath, because the silence that precedes the wind is the same that comes before miracles. The day Pope Leo XIV decided to publicly reaffirm his confidence in Cardinal Pietro Parolin was not marked by pomp or ceremony. There were no camera flashes or pre-arranged editorials. It was a simple gesture, almost monastic but with a symbolic, the power that spread like incense rising through the invisible naves of the church. That morning, the Pope had celebrated a private mass with a few priests in the Redemptoris Mater Chapel. At the end of the liturgy, without warning, he approached a small wooden ambo and, in a low but firm voice, proclaimed, "Today, before the altar of the living God, I wish to express my deep gratitude for one who has been a discreet but constant beacon of peace diplomacy, Cardinal Pietro Parolin. His mission is not one of speeches but of presence, not on the stage but in the last pew, and it is precisely there that those who truly serve flourish." The gesture was immediately interpreted as a declaration of continuity, not only institutional but spiritual, at a time when the Church faces the challenge of not losing itself amid external noise and internal divisions. The figure of Parolin represents the invisible axis upon which many silent balances rest. A backstage conductor, his vocation is not visibility, but coherence. Since the beginning of his mission as Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin had become known for a spirituality that harmonizes the realism of Vatican politics with the hope of the gospel. In rare interviews, he always preferred measured phrases over fiery manifestos. In documents, he favored listening over judgment. To many, his presence was synonymous with stability. By publicly expressing his trust in the Cardinal, Leo XIV was not merely reaffirming a personal choice, he was sending a signal to the world. The Church does not live on theatrical ruptures but on silent fidelities. It does not sustain itself on headlines but on discrete foundations, like that of a man who, even amid crises, never lost his calm. And it was this calm that allowed the Vatican to keep open bridges with conflict zones, hostile governments, and distant cultures. More than an administrative figure, Parolin came to be seen, after this gesture, as a guardian of the Church's internal rhythm, a rhythm that is neither rushed nor reactive, but prayerful. A rhythm that listens more than it imposes, that waits more than it demands, that silences itself only to speak afterward. In the days following the announcement, a subtle movement that began within ecclesiastical corridors. Young priests started studying Parolin's life and writings. Seminaries included excerpts from his homilies in their curriculum. Religious communities held days of prayer for the intentions of the Holy See's servants, and secular newspapers, accustomed to portraying the Vatican with cynicism, found themselves compelled to acknowledge the depth of leadership rooted in serenity. Leo XIV, faithful to the style marking his pontificate, did not make a show of that moment, but by entrusting Parolin not only with a position but with a symbolic place at the heart of his spiritual project, he made clear the Church needs diplomats who pray, theologians who listen, administrators who kneel, and Parolin is all of these. Some expected the Pope to appoint a new name, a more media-friendly face, a radical change. But Leo XIV once again showed that the true revolution of the Church begins from within, and that often the most prophetic gesture is simply to continue trusting the one who, even in the dark, remains faithful. And so, without altering external structures, Pope Leo XIV changed the tone of ecclesial leadership once again. With a gesture, with trust, with the courage to reaffirm that the sacred also dwells in the everyday. It was late afternoon in Rome. The orange light draped over the Vatican gardens like a veil, almost as if time itself bowed before what was about to be revealed. An elderly priest, who had worked for over 4 decades in the discreet corridors of the Roman Curia, was overheard confiding to a young seminarian, Parolin's appointment was not just a political decision, it was a liturgical act, because when a pacified heart occupies a seat of command, the Church begins to breathe in a spiritual rhythm. That month, something unusual began to manifest behind the scenes of the Church, and it was not visible to hurried eyes. There were no abrupt reforms, no media decrees, no fiery speeches, but the rooms fell silent. The corridors, once tense, became more human. Private audiences were scheduled with less haste, and officials began saying that the days felt ... lighter. It was not magic. It was the fruit of a soul that had made diplomacy a form of prayer. Pietro Parolin, now kept as Secretary of State by Pope Leo XIV, was not merely the Vatican's political brain, he was the gentle heart that listened before deciding. His continuation in that role symbolized something rare. The Church's real attempt not just to position itself in the world, but to reconcile with it, not ideologically, but pastorally, not with weapons, but with listening. Yes, Leo XIV could have chosen a younger name, a more media-savvy one, a more strategic one, but he chose Parolin's discreet meek, and that says it all. At the first post-announcement meeting, held with representatives from diocesan war zones such as Myanmar, South Sudan, and Syria, Parolin brought no maps, no reports, only a worn wooden crucifix and an unlit candle. He placed both on the table and said, "Before we talk about treaties, let us rekindle the light of compassion." And it was there, in that small gesture, that everything began to change. Vatican embassies worldwide reported In the following weeks, a sudden increase in requests for spiritual listening conversations, not only from Catholic leaders, but from rabbis, imams, evangelical pastors, secular authorities, social activists, even confessed atheists. Everyone wanted to know, why does a pope keep such a silent diplomat in power? The answer came not in words but in Parolin's gaze. He listened with his eyes. He comforted with his presence. He offered the world a new form of power, a power that does not impose itself but offers itself as a space for reconciliation. Internally, Leo XIV's gesture caused a domino effect in other dicasteries. Secretaries began opening meetings with silent prayer. Archbishops started checking on their staff, asking, "How is your soul?" And pontifical universities included moments of meditation and silence in doctrine classes. It was as if a new pedagogy was emerging with its epicenter in Pietro Parolin's patience. But the most impressive thing was not in the numbers. It was in the signs that at the Basilica of St. John Lateran, where Parolin was seen kneeling for long minutes before the image of the crucified Christ, a seminarian reported that the air smelled of olive trees. In Assisi, a Franciscan community began receiving anonymous letters with handwritten excerpts from Gaudium et Spes, accompanied by small wooden crosses, a gesture later discovered to be an initiative by young diplomats trained under Parolin. In the Holy Land, a rabbi wrote to the Vatican saying, "I don't know if I believe your dogmas, but I believe in the way this man walks." The impact was global. In Geneva, the UN invited Parolin to open a conference on international mediation, not as a politician, but as an ambassador of sacred listening. In Africa, missionaries reported that armed groups, upon learning of his continued presence, suspended attacks for 48 hours as a sign of respect. And in Brazil, a group of indigenous youth sent a rosary made of native seeds as a gift to the cardinal, with a single message: "Thank you for not forgetting us." What was happening was not visible on the news. It was not headline news on major portals, but it was felt in hospitals, in prisons, in refugee camps. Because sometimes, all the world needs is a man who says with his heart, "I hear you." Leo XIV understood that there are diplomats who negotiate agreements, but there are those who negotiate the peace of the human soul. And that is why he chose Parolin not as one who merely signs treaties, but as one who signs hopes that the world has had. Warrior popes, it has had juridical popes, it has had martyr popes. But with Leo XIV and Parolin, the world began to see the rise of something new, an alliance between the spirit of silence and the art of diplomacy. And in that encounter, a new way of governing began to sprout, one that asks for no applause, nor headlines, but that invites the whole church to ask the hardest question of our time before deciding ... Did you listen? There were no trumpets, no bells were rung, but inside the walls of the Vatican, something happened, and the whole world, even without understanding, felt it. The morning after the reaffirmation of Pietro Parolin as Secretary of State, Pope Leo XIV entered alone into the Redemptoris Mater Chapel, at the heart of the Apostolic Palace. No journalists, no ceremony, no prepared altar, just him, silence, and a lit candle. What happened there, few people saw, but those who did, never forgot. A Swiss guard on duty reported, with a trembling voice, that the Holy Father, upon entering, removed his sandals and knelt directly on the cold chapel floor. He carried only a white envelope. Inside it, a single sheet, a handwritten letter addressed to Cardinal Pietro Parolin, according to sources close to the matter. It contained the simplest and rarest words a pope can say: "Thank you for remaining faithful to the silence of God." Leo XIV remained kneeling for 40 minutes. During that time, monks near the chapel said they heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, as if the morning wind was passing through the walls and touching the floor. But there was no wind, only silence and presence. There, in that space of stone and light, the Pope was not merely reaffirming an administrative decision. He was reaffirming a new kind of authority, the authority that kneels, that listens, that yields, that prays before acting. That was what shocked the world, not a scandal, not a visible revolution, but the fact that the most powerful man in the Church chose to honor the most discreet of his cardinals with what the saints call interior adoration, a gesture that seeks no applause, only communion. The modern world, so accustomed to power, performance, and pragmatism, did not know how to react. Some media outlets tried to label the decision as conservative, others called it progressive, but no political term could capture what had happened, because what happened was mystical. That same afternoon, on the other side of the world, in a small parish in the Philippines, a 10-year-old girl, knowing nothing of these events, asked her catechist, "Auntie, does God kneel too?" The catechist, moved, answered only with a look, because there lay the mystery. When a pope kneels to thank a man who lives kneeling, heaven bows with him. And so began what many now quietly call the revolution of the spirit. No slogans, no polarization, no decrees of rupture, but with gestures so silent, so poetic, so human, that they can only be inspired by God. Churches did not change their facades, but their interiors changed. The faithful did not start debating more, they started listening more. Priests did not preach louder, they preached more, kneeling, and the youth, yes, The youth who so many had already given up on began to return, not by advertising campaigns, but by thirst. Thirst for something that would not push them into faith, but draw them to its center where dwells the silence that heals. This was Leo XIV's choice, to make the Vatican not a palace of decisions, but a sanctuary of listening. And this was Pietro Parolin's mission, to remind the Church that the world can only be reconciled when authority is reconciled with meekness. You have read this far, and it is no accident. Perhaps, as you heard this story, something was kindled in your heart, a breath, a calling, a remembrance, and perhaps you cannot explain it. That's okay, because the Spirit does not always shout. Sometimes He only whispers. If this story touched you, pause for a moment, close your eyes, breathe, and, if you can, kneel, even if only for 30 seconds, even without words, even without knowing where to start. Because sometimes, all God needs is a gesture, a small gesture that says, I am here. Comment below, Lord, teach me to listen before I decide. Share this video with someone who needs to rediscover the meekness of faith. Subscribe and turn on the bell so the next message reaches you, even in silence. And remember, when authority kneels, heaven rises.